activities, and we're still doing these live streams with some amazing people. And today I'm super lucky to be here with Jeff Thompson with Columbia Psychiatry, and we are going to talk about a lot of different things, but specifically about law enforcement, suicide prevention, and awareness. And so I think let's just kick it off, Jeff, and I'm going to send it over to you. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, why we're talking about this, why is this important?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it. Yeah, maybe I'll briefly introduce myself. I won't be long-winded because nobody wants to really hear about my background, but I'm pretty proud of the work that I've been involved in.
You should be.
I work with. Yeah. So I have a couple of different roles and hats that I wear. I'm a research adjunct associate research scientist at Columbia University Medical Center in the Department of Psychiatry. I work for some amazing, great people in the world of suicide prevention, including Dr. Andy Auerbach and Dr. John Mann. And the way I describe it is, so I try to use my researcher academic hat to infiltrate and enhance the work I do in my other professional life, which I'm a detective in the New York City Police Department, NYPD detective for just over 18 years. And I'm the NYPD's mental health and wellness coordinator. So it's sort of, I'm speaking from the capacity of the work that I do at Columbia and how I share it with the work I do at the NYPD and other law enforcement agencies across the US, Canada, and across the world, especially like in the UK, as well as Australia. And for today's topic, it's just, I want to share some of the things that I'm involved in and just the great people that I collaborate with, try to provide people with just somewhat of a more detailed understanding of suicidology, but also then specifically how it impacts law enforcement. But of course, it's by no means limited to just law enforcement, if that makes sense. And Chris, please feel free to jump in, questions, comments. Yeah. If I'm speaking too fast with my New York accent, I can slow down. I can't change the voice. Sorry, not sorry. And for the audience, for those that are here live with us, I think you can type in your questions. I know Chris will help me out and monitor those. Otherwise, I guess so I guess as far as like a structure, some things I want to cover is just some basic stats, the structured approach that I utilize, partnerships, the idea of police culture, and then ultimately the last thing that I talk about is like that mindset of trying to think different. And first, with stats, I'm not big into just throwing out statistics for no reason. It's got to have a purpose to it. And the one that I just like to share with everybody, both the police audience and non-police audience here, is more law enforcement officers across the country. And I believe it's for the past 4 years, more law enforcement officers in the United States have died by suicide compared to being killed in line of duty. And again, let me just say that again, just slightly different. Law enforcement officers are killing themselves more than the bad guys are taking our lives. And that's awful. It's unacceptable. And we do, and when I say we in my law enforcement, we the men and women across this country and all across the world in policing, they do such a great job of helping the public in their worst moments. We just got to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and our own mental health, our well-being, our personal resilience. And that's not selfish. It absolutely isn't selfish. It's smart. And you think about it, Chris, for a moment. Think about all the things we can argue about. And well, you and I never really argued before, but imagine all the things we could potentially argue about, whether politics or anything. And by the way, for those listening, we're not going to bring up politics or any of that stuff. But I'd like to say in terms of law enforcement, this truly is one of those things that I think is that cliche win-win, and it's beyond arguing. And the more we do these suicide prevention efforts, but also besides just the realm of prevention, we want to promote positive mental health and well-being in law enforcement. Why? As individuals, that makes them better at what they do. And they're police. And what's the job of the police? Keeping the public safe. So there's where I'd say it's not a cliche win-win. Legitimately, everybody wins when individual officers are taking care of themselves because they create the collective agency they work for, and the agency is responsible for keeping the public safe. So, and again, the suicide rate is just awfully high in policing. But also, you look at it too, is some other connected terrible statistics are where, generally speaking, police have higher rates of depression, anxiety, alcohol, substance abuse. And what does that mean? It's not to paint a doom and gloom picture. It just yet again reminds, I think, those involved in law enforcement and those trying to help members of law enforcement to look after themselves. And it's truly a work in progress. And when we talk about taking care of themselves, It's both on the agency level as well as the individual level. And it's not one or the other. It really, truly is a combination of both. And when I move it, the next thing I just wanted to cover is the structured approach. And I look at it from 3 levels. So it's first the preventative proactive outreach that it needs to be engaged in. Then what are we doing to help law enforcement members when they're in the midst of a personal crisis? And then the third stage is the unfortunate stage of suicide postvention. And we look at it from that world of when it is unfortunate when somebody does die by suicide in law enforcement, how are we making sure we understand as much as we can, because that impacts then those other 2 stages, the preventative proactive outreach, as well as trying to help members that are in the midst of crisis. I'll dig a little bit deeper into each of those. So the preventative proactive outreach is, again, it's not just suicide prevention. It's looking more broadly basis, trying to make sure our members are doing good. And again, we're human beings as well. And it's those ideas of the mental and physical health, nutrition, sleep. Sleep's another really, really critical thing that unfortunately the data shows that police officers, generally speaking, just have some really trouble with sleep and getting a proper night's sleep. And one of them obviously is because of shift work, but it's also regardless of what shift they work, even if they aren't on midnights, it's just across the board. And some of the work that I do, a colleague at Columbia, Dr. Carl Bazil, has helped us in the NYPD and other agencies as well. The things that I like, again, I'm incredibly biased working with people at Columbia, for example, is yes, they're very smart, but when they share this information, it's practical. And that's something I'm very, it's important. We can't share research and data that isn't then practical and able to be implemented in policing. It's wasteful. It's wasteful of people's time. And somebody like Dr. Carl Brazil just provides practical advice and tips that us as police can actually use. And this is where I say to you again, Chris, it's not just us as police, because guess what? I'm looking at you and I'm looking at me. We're both human beings here. So if it works for police, it sure as hell is going to work for the public.
Well, and that's I want to point in a couple of things here. You were talking about, like, if we're doing things that save law enforcement folks, that's, it's not just law enforcement folks that we're talking about. Like you just said, I mean, these are people too. Like, these are people in our community who we want to make sure have just as much, if not more, sometimes resources for very specific things than other people. Like, everybody deserves to be taken care of, and everybody deserves to have these mental health resources. And then the other thing that you just pointed out too is that, like, if you have, I mean, I'm all about action too. I think if we have something that we can take and implement, and we have evidence to back it up, that's like the gold standard, right? But for cops and for law enforcement folks who really, like, they're goal oriented, they're direction oriented, like, things need to happen. It's not just like, oh, well, this is it. Like, this is how it should be, right? You need to be able to provide them with something that they can go and use. And so I think that's what you're saying is so critical about this work.
Yeah, and it's also, as you were saying that, I was thinking a couple of things. Also, how complicated it is, right? So let's not sugarcoat it. It's not easy, but who the hell said it was supposed to be easy, right? And for something as serious as suicide prevention, I was thinking, like, some great work by another colleague, a great friend of mine and a really brilliant researcher over in the UK, Dr. Jennifer Wild, has done stuff on research on actual change in a positive way for law enforcement and other first responders, that it also shows it's limiting just psychoeducation. And it's not to say psychoeducation isn't helpful or important, but it can't stop there, because the line I was thinking as you were talking is, no amount of positive thinking can ever replace positive action. Positive thinking is supposed to lead to the actions and the doables. And that's where I think it appeals when it's presented that way to law enforcement, because we are action oriented. And it's that, again, that preventative proactive outreach can't be just these one-off trainings either to raise awareness of it. It's how do we make it sustainable, but also how do we do it where I call it, purposeful redundancy, to keep it constantly out there, but not to the point where people, the message gets drowned out, or it just people become dismissive because they've heard it so many times. And that sort of ties into, which I'll mention later, that whole think different aspect. But then, so that's the preventative proactive outreach. The next step then is, what are we doing for our members when they're in the midst of a personal crisis, and how are we making sure we help them? And one of the things that I wanted to share with this too is and I know you and I have done work together as well as with, excuse me, with AAS on reporting on suicide. But what I think more broadly based, what I'm referring to here in this moment is the words we use truly do matter. It's not a cliche, right? And it's that idea when we talk about stigma, especially in policing, the first thing that comes to my mind is how we helping our brothers and sisters when they're in crisis. Again, it's that idea of real resilience is reaching out for help when you need it. And much like out on a patrol officer will reach out, will over the radio call for backup during a really tough job. It's got to be the same exact thing. It's acceptable when they're going through a tough time in their life to reach out for help. It really should be no different. But then you think about the terminology, and for any of you fellow law enforcement that are tuning into this, like at least up here in the Northeast, the term, like if they're getting help and say they had to have their firearm taken away while they get in some mental health care and support, we would sometimes you hear people say, oh, that guy's jammed up. He had his gun taken away. And this I'd say, well, hold on a second. How the hell is that jammed up? They're getting the help they need and deserve. And just because they don't have their firearm on them at the moment, that is the opposite of jammed up. That's real strength. And we need to stop using terms like that because it really does. You know what it does? First of all, it's crappy to say that about the officer getting help. But then you think about it when officers hear that, and if they're going through a struggle or at some point in the future they're going through a struggle, that pushes them away from help seeking. And not only do we as individuals have to try to shift away from doing that, we also need as a group collectively call people out on that as respectful as possible. And it's not making people feel dumb or stupid or bad. It's just, it's reminding people saying, hey, that kind of language, it's just not helpful. And I think it's important to point that out. The other really critical thing is when we're offering support to fellow members in law enforcement when they're in the midst of a crisis, it's two-pronged. Support services and resources within the agency as well as outside the agency. And again, let's not beat around the bush here. Sometimes part of an officer's personal crisis is part of their professional work. Stuff at work is helping in a bad way or is detrimental to whatever it is that's putting them in crisis. So no matter how great the support services in an agency is, they might not ever use it because they're blaming the agency for part of their issues. And I'm not saying who's right or wrong, is it accurate or inaccurate? That doesn't matter. Perception shapes reality. So it's very critical, yes, to have in-house support and resources, but also outside. And that's the other thing too, is when we look at it from that mindset too, is it's getting help is what matters. Where they get it, who cares? And again, in the NYPD as an example, we have different resources. Everybody says the same message. And that's where like another group I'd like to mention too is we've got a great, the Fraternal Order of Police. And Sherry Martin, who's one of the directors there, she's working on a program with the FOP across the country to have resources, especially for smaller agencies that don't have the bandwidth or, you know, the budget to have in-house support services necessarily as much as like a large agency like NYPD, LA, Boston, Philly, having resources that are vetted to go out and get professional care and services. And I think that's pretty substantial. Yeah.
Really quickly, just for folks who may not be aware of the FOP, what sort of structure do they have? Why is that important in what you're talking about?
Sorry. Great question. And I highly recommend it for the people that are on Facebook. They're on Facebook as well. They're on Twitter. And so it's the Fraternal Order of Police. And I guess the easiest way to put it, and I guess at some future point, if Sherry comes on here, she can correct me, but I've heard her say they're basically almost like the union representation or the membership organization for across the country. And they're out there to look after the men and women in policing. And they put such an emphasis on mental health. You want to talk about words backing up actions. They made her a national director, which is a really significant position within the FOP. And she's in charge of overseeing the mental health and well-being for the FOP. And I forget how many like tens of thousands of members they have across the country. It's significant. And one of the projects that they're working on is getting people vetting psychologists and the psychiatrists across the country. So one of the toughest things is being open to getting help. But then you get it too if they're feeling anxiety and feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes on top of that is just trying to find the right resources. So they're stepping in and providing something super critical. And I applaud what they're doing as well. So that kind of covers the DERN part. And then the unfortunate third level is that postvention and what happens when a brother or sister does die by suicide. And again, this is where I give another a round of recognition to some federal agencies. And I believe it's fallen under the FBI that's trying to actually collect data on this. And Blue Help and Badge of Life, they had been doing it. First Badge of Life, then Blue Help, then took over it, I believe, of collecting data, but it was voluntary. People would submit it, where the FBI is trying to have more of a national statistics on this. And it's not just statistics for the hell of it. And first of all, it's each one of those numbers is a real life, a real brother or sister that took their life. And it's sad and it's awful. And think about it, especially in the world of law enforcement. This was somebody dedicating their adult life to looking after others, and then they ended up taking their own. And so we're not just keeping stats for the hell of it, but each one is significant. But then when we collect them the right way, that's where it's, first of all, we owe it to find out to that fallen brother or sister why they died by suicide. And I know this will tie into what we'll talk a little bit later about the psychological autopsy. And it's something like that's done, one, because we owe it to that fallen brother or sister, but two, when you do this and collect the right data in the right way, it helps for themes to be established. And for example, like if a lot of the people that died by suicide in law enforcement, if they were in the midst of a relationship breakup and using and abusing alcohol and had sleep deficiency issues, well, that's how you guide your preventative proactive outreach, maybe more so on maybe sleep tips, or reminding people, hey, if somebody's going through a bad breakup, check in with that brother or sister that's on patrol with you. Now, does it mean they're suicidal necessarily? No, it just means they're going through a really hard time. And seemingly us as police, it hits us a lot harder compared to others. And I don't know, what do you like? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think this is a really great thing to point out, because data collection, I think nationally is sort of haphazardly collected, but with groups like law enforcement, it's sometimes much worse. I know in our conversations with Blue Help, we started discovering that it would take, it takes nationally 2 years to 18 months to get national data. But in some instances with law enforcement folks, it can take longer. It can be shrouded in certain like issues, right? Whether it's politics or whether it's internal issues, whatever. So there are a lot of problems with collecting data, but like you were talking about, it's so important to be able to use that data to then go and have those actions where you can say, like, here's a pattern of certain issues, just like we would with clusters of suicides in a community. If we start seeing certain issues pop up, now we know, okay, well, we have to go talk to our folks about what's going on here in this community, regardless of whether it's law enforcement or somewhere else. But now we have something to kind of go on, and that's sort of like, that's overarchingly why data is so important, and why it's important to get right, and why it's important to get fast, right? So I think you're talking about honoring these folks. I think that's the perfect way to phrase it, because when we experience loss, I think a lot of suicide loss survivors say, I don't want this to happen to someone else. I want to do whatever we can to make sure that this doesn't happen again. This is exactly why. And this is how I think one of the major ways that we can do it. One of the other things I think is really important too, that you pointed out, is that research is starting to show a lot of environmental factors, social determinants, right? Not just mental health issues. It can be things like breakups. It can be things like financial issues. It can be things like sleep. All of these things can compound and force this complex issue of suicide. So I don't know if, and maybe you can talk to this too, if that's something that is more apparent in the law enforcement community, or if that impacts law enforcement folks differently, or if you have a sense of what that's like for those environmental factors or not.
Well, yeah. So, and this is more just anecdotal, not data backed, but from my experiences of having helped and supported different agencies, although again, not one specific, but like I'd say probably over 150 officer suicides. And when you talk about it, aside of like putting aside mental health conditions, it's that idea of like the environmental things, like truly what comes up a lot is that bad breakup. And let's be very clear, there's no single cause to suicide. Suicide's very complicated. And people will say inaccurately, oh, the reason that officer took his life is because his wife left him. So, well, no, hold on. We can't say that, because that can't be true. Because if officers were taking their lives due to a breakup, we'd have, unfortunately, how many a year due to the high divorce and separation rate?
Right.
Now, could that have
there
been
are a lot
part
of people? Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of people that go through breakups but don't kill themselves. So what's going on there? Yeah.
So, and that's with the whole idea of how complicated it truly is. But it's saying, well, okay, hold on. And this is like people like me and others that I work with trying to figure out, well, what's everything that was going on in that person's life prior to them dying by suicide, and what happened differently recently prior to their suicide than what was going on previously in their life. And it's a bunch of, I don't know, for lack of a better metaphor, I guess it's a bunch of bad puzzle pieces coming together. But also, you talk about environment, the timing, because you think about what can put somebody in a crisis. Something might put somebody in a crisis when they're, and I'm just making up, when they're 38. But if it happened to them when they were 27, it would be different. So it's not just, and this is where I'm adamant again, it can't be checklist mentality, right? Because think about how absurd that would be. Hey, if you're going through a divorce, we've got to do a suicidal assessment. Come on. That's foolish, and that's counterproductive. But it's then what I am saying is when somebody is going through a bad breakup, or if you notice also their increase in drinking, and then also you add to that, what's their work life condition then? And then also, are they no longer hanging out with people and isolating themselves? Now all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, here's a bunch of either red flags or whatever, not quite red. It's yet again cause for worry and concern, not necessarily suicidal, but it's also like someone's suffering. And just one of those things alone is cause for concern. And this is why I'd say, let's not just put on our blinders of just suicide prevention. Let's just make sure it's that, and this is where it goes from the post-prevention, brings you right back up to the top, to the prevention proactive outreach too. And it's guided though by that data. And unless you have that data, you're relying then on other data from other areas outside law enforcement, which is still very helpful as well. It's just, let's make sure then it's being complemented with data within our own profession, right?
Yeah, and I didn't mean to get us off on a tangent about environmental stuff, but no, I think that it helps to have it put in that perspective that even if folks are experiencing multiple warning signs or experiencing things that come off as warning signs, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily suicidal, but it also doesn't hurt to just check in. Right. And just see like, how are you doing? What can I help you? Like, is there anything that I can do for you right now?
And generally mean it too. Not one of those, hey, how you doing? And then moving on to like, and so that sort of ties in, just to jump for a quicker, I guess, that whole culture aspect. And with the way I had it in my notes, culture / peer support. The only way you can ever find out if somebody's suicidal is by asking them. There's no other way. And you got to be direct when you ask that question. And I know this is like suicidology 101 for people like you and myself and others, someone in here, but this is still new to people. And let's get rid of that myth. You're not planting the idea of suicide in somebody's head by asking them. And from my experiences, I do work, I'm a volunteer with Crisis Text Line as well. And learning great training I had from them as a crisis counselor with them, it's having to ask that question. And this is my thing for anybody that's not sure, you need to ask them. And how do you ask them? Go get trained in it. And like mental health first aid or other awesome trainings out there that are free. And this is where, remember I talked about the agency, but also the individual. This is where my appeal to every individual out there that's listening to this, what are you doing about it? Stop sitting there waiting for your agency to do something, or if they're not doing something, is that okay? No, that's still not okay. But my appeal is, what are you doing? What are you doing to first look after yourself? And I'm not saying this to try and be a jerk either. It's just, it's that call to action. And that's where, I don't know, maybe I'm just getting a little bit angrier or grumpier as I get older, but I'm honestly, but like I look at it and 100%, I'm sick and tired of anyone dying by suicide, especially fellow law enforcement members, and get trained. But here's the other thing. If you're sitting there and you're worried and you're just not sure if you can ask somebody, that's okay too. My appeal to that, then reach out to somebody that can ask them, because much like how that person in crisis isn't alone, neither are you with trying to get that person help either. Reach out to somebody. And that's where we talk about that cultural shift with policing and how do we fight stigma and stuff. I think a big piece to the puzzle, not the sole piece to the puzzle, but I think a substantial piece is peer support for many, many reasons. And peer support, like it's a 4 to 5 day training. And it's just, I think it's phenomenal. There's plenty of agencies that have it. But one of the key things I think that shouldn't be overlooked is peer support, or the first level eyes and ears in a precinct, a command, or whatever the terminology is used, and they're spread out throughout an entire agency. But this is where I look at it as also in the idea, how do you create cultural change? The more peer support members are, the more you have people in that agency that adhere to this mindset. of the best way to look after others is looking after yourself first and foremost. And it spreads. And that's the good kind of contagion. When you mention contagion, contagion isn't always bad. And I know how we're still in the COVID world, right? But contagion and, that kind of stuff, it's not always a bad thing. And this is where let's do the cultural change in a positive way. And peer support is critical to that. I think absolutely critical. And it also reminds people that become peer support members in agencies, it reminds them they're not the only ones that have this positive mindset. And it's not taboo to mention mental health and looking after yourself. And, self-compassion isn't a soft, fluffy word. It's hardcore resilience.
Yeah, they don't have to feel like the nerds who get A+ on the tests all the time, right? Like this is stuff that people need to be caring about, and it shows them that they're not alone in that. Ruth asked, do we have a link or info on a peer support specialist program, or is this? Are you talking about?
I'd be happy to send information on some of the programs. You can reach out to me. Can I type in that?
I can type it for you. Yeah.
Can just put my email in there, please. JT2768 at cumc.columbia.edu.
All right, I will put your Columbia one in there.
Or if it's also easier, this is an awful shameless plug. You can send me a DM on Twitter at Jeff T Ph.D. I couldn't even say that without laughing, but sometimes it's easier. That's the only reason
I've connected with a lot of people on social media that way. It works.
And if you happen to follow me, okay, even better. I get nothing out of it.
Go ahead and follow Jeff just for the heck of it. I'm sure he posts great stuff.
For the endorsement, Chris. Honestly, that reminds me, and Chris, you and I have done these things in one fashion or another together. And something I do like to point out, because we were just having, I felt like a good, genuine laugh. When Chris and I do this, and sometimes we'll make a joke or we'll have a laugh, let me be clear about two things. We're not minimizing the severity of the topic at hand. Absolutely not. We're not. But how humor truly is an important factor in resilience, absolutely. So we're not minimizing things, but given the seriousness of the work that I'm involved in, Chris and the other people on here, like that's where self-compassion is real. We've got to be able to have some just good-hearted, fun conversations too, because if all we see things are through the seriousness, that's too much to take on. And I remind people that it's okay to have a laugh or, just to relax and chill out, because yet again, here's another self word that's not soft and fluffy. Self-care, it truly is something that needs to be practiced, not talk about. And I enjoy these conversations with you, Chris, and having these, because I know we'll share info, but it's also, I have a good time. I hope you are.
Yeah. I'm stressed the entire time. No,
no, I
think it's, I think it says something though too. I think when we're talking about things like having these conversations with folks in our community, whether it's law enforcement or in another setting, having that genuine connection with someone can be as easy as just having a conversation, right? Like suicide prevention starts, I think, with the conversation. And while this is a really serious topic, and when you're having this with someone who might be experiencing thoughts or just experiencing life stressors, having that sort of genuine sort of connection and having that conversation, having that chit chat and that banter can soften some of that, and it makes it real, right? You can say, hey, we've been talking and we've been having fun here, and you've been kind of joking about this stuff. And sometimes when people talk about going through a breakup, they're thinking about suicide, and I'm just wondering if that's something that you've been thinking about. And if the person says no and it ends up in joking banter back and forth again, great. You know where you stand. They know that they can talk to you about suicide. They know that you can have that conversation with them. So I think that is really important. And I think when you're talking about that peer support component, a lot of that is what you see in those sort of relationships, and knowing that you're surrounded by these people can be really helpful.
Yeah, and you think about it with peer support too, it's why we emphasize that a lot is like whoever, like you can't go out and do talks all day, right? And then when you leave that precinct or that command, then it's the cops that work there are still there. And my mind says, so let's make sure those people are trained, especially the ones that people already go up to and talk to, or that they're the go-to person. Let's make sure we give them even better skills at what they're already good at. And that's the way we describe peer support. And it's like the hallmark of a peer support training that I emphasize It's 4 simple steps. Ask, listen, encourage, follow up. And that's not limited to any agency anywhere. Ask, listen, encourage, follow up. Ask. Genuinely check in with somebody, see how they're doing. Then after you ask them, listen. Actually listen to what they have to say. This is where I talked about like crisis communication skills, proper active listening skills. Not just active listening isn't just letting the person talk. You've got to be able, and here it is again why suicidology and understanding suicide is important. What you don't know, you don't know. So like, and you know, it's like sometimes people will say outright, yeah, I don't want to live. But sometimes more subtle statements like, oh, this is all just too much. Or I just wish it would all end. Or I wish I wouldn't wake up. Or I just want to sleep forever. When you have training that, like, well, hold on a second. Sometimes when people say something like that, they have thoughts about taking their life. Is that what you're thinking? And that's where the training ties into with respect to that. The encourage, this is the other thing too. Remember I said peer support, big piece to the puzzle, not the entire puzzle. The encourage is when sometimes you hand them off to people that are better trained. And that's not knocking the peer support member. It just means they're one level of support, there's higher levels of support. And that's where the encourage is connecting the person in crisis with more help if more help is needed and beyond what the expectations are of a peer support member. And then the critical 4th one is we can't forget this follow up. So you check in with someone. So here's the other thing, Chris. Just because you're the peer support member, and even if you're not an official peer support member, you can still play that role no matter who you are. Mm-hmm. Just because you notice somebody maybe a little bit different and you check in on them, you know, you do the ask and the listen, just because you check in on it doesn't mean they're ready to talk to you. So that's where the follow-up comes in. You have a conversation. Maybe they don't want to talk that day. You follow up a day or two later in the week saying, hey, look, imagine like if it was you. Hey, Chris, I know I asked you on Thursday. We had a brief chat on how you were doing. And imagine then this was Saturday or Sunday. I say, I just wanted to check in again and remind you, if you ever need anything, just please reach out to me or reach out to somebody. And that's where the person might say, oh, actually, yeah, you know what? Do you have a moment? And that's why follow-up shows that you're genuine and you're not just doing some sort of checkbox mentality mindset. You know, the other thing that you mentioned too is how important that proactive outreach is. And again, it's not just peer support, because think about it. When you're building rapport and trust, and the thing I was thinking while you were saying it is, I was thinking about the role of policing. We want to build trust and respect and rapport with the community. And then if they ever have information, they're more likely to share it with us, right? That's what proactive policing is. It's the same mindset that you apply to the suicide prevention models. The more we do outreach in a genuine manner, the more that person will be willing, I think, to reach out to people like me if they are in a state of crisis. Because instead of saying, oh, I don't know who this guy is, it's saying, hey, wait, you know what? I know Jeff. I trust him. I can reach out to him. And I'm not just speaking about me. I'm using myself as an example. It's these people in these peer support capacities where they know the person instead of just necessarily calling a hotline. And plenty of people do, because, which is great too. I'm just saying it's that added layer, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And why not have additional layers of support, right? And I think when we think about a lot of different settings and a lot of different cultures and a lot of different people in general, the first people that they tend to reach out to are those that they are comfortable with, those that they can trust, whether it's friends, parents, right, coworkers that they see every day. So having those peer specialists around and having them in that setting is really good. I think one of the things that was really important that you mentioned too is that, you know, it's okay to set boundaries in these situations too, and understand that like expectations can be set before that conversation even happens. And if somebody's like, you know what, I think it sounds like you're going through a lot of stuff and you're thinking about suicide, and I want to make sure that you get the proper care.
Right.
Let's go talk to so and so. Right. Like here's a boundary that is set for safety and for comfort, and making sure that that person gets the appropriate level of care. Well, not a lot of people do that.
Right. And you just mentioned safety and comfort. And this is where I remind people too, when you say that, it's not just for the person in crisis, it's for that peer support member. Safety and comfort, knowing what their role is and knowing what it's not. And I quite often when I teach and train peer support, I tell people arguably one of the hardest things to learn and accept as a peer support member is that you're not there to fix it. You're not their problem solver. Your job isn't to fix all their issues. Your job is to be there with them and help them navigate it. And like, again, shout out to Crisis Text Line. We use their line because I don't think they trademarked it. If it is, I guess They'll
What
reach out
is
to me and tell.
what is the number that you have there for them?
So it's so we use for law enforcement, text the keyword blue to 741-741. And in this context, though, like the line they use is getting people from a hot moment to a cooler calm. And I
That's
just feel
cool.
like that's so simple and brilliant. That's your role as a peer support member, a friend, brother, sister, father, whatever, wife, to help anybody in crisis. And I'm not saying if it's a suicide or a suicidal where they've got to have an immediate intervention, but generally speaking, helping people get from their hot moment to a cooler calm. And it's that idea of that's your job as a peer support member, generally speaking, is you're there to help them figure out what's best next to do. And again, I'm not talking about when they're suicidal. I'm speaking just more general crisis state. But I'm glad you put that in the chat box because, which leads me into the next topic I wanted to share was the idea of partnerships and how important they are. And fortunately, I've made some really great partnerships, and we've shared our resources. And there's a lot of other agencies out there with great partnerships. Crisis Text Line is one of the best ones, and the support that they give us in law enforcement and first responders is phenomenal. And basically, so here's the thing, right? Where it also ties into peer support in a sense. Police, law enforcement members will say, "Oh, I don't want to reach out to some person. They don't understand what it's like to be a cop." And they say, "Okay, well, that's why I reach out to a peer support member." And then, like for example, if you text blue to 741-741, it's 24/7. It's anonymous. It's free. What that just simply tells the crisis counselor on the receiving end that you're in law enforcement somewhere in the country. That's for the U.S. only. That keyword. And you're just having a hard time. So it just gives the crisis counselor a bit of a heads up that it's somebody in law enforcement. They have no idea who you are.
Yeah, but it gives them some important context too. And Jose mentioned in the chat too that helpline counselors at 211 are trained in active listening skills. That's absolutely true. We accredit a lot of 211 centers.
Right.
And one of our accreditation requirements is that training in active and reflective listening. So that's absolutely true. Jackie said that. Jackie, hello, Jackie. We just had Jackie on a couple days ago.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
Great. It was really good. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for joining me, Jackie. Reciprocity.
And she said that she's encouraged to hear that the FOP is adapting some of those mental health and evidence-based programs. So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is, I think, going to be a little bit surprising to folks, and that this isn't stuff that's, widely known that this community is really working hard on this stuff.
And that's exactly it. It's yet again what we don't know, and maybe it's people like me and you, Chris, us teaming together to amplify it. And I honestly think it's something like this that helps raise awareness of that, and that's where it truly ties into what I was just starting on, the idea of partnerships. Yes. And working with AAS and other groups that I'll just put out there that people aren't familiar, like Blue Help is a great organization. The International Association for Chiefs of Police, the IACP, the incredible work that they've been doing, and arguably one of the leaders in it in law enforcement and mental health. And then also like even a subset, a group that I work very closely with, the NIOA. So that's basically the PIOs, the public information officers, and the press officers for first responders, not just policing, to make sure that reporting on suicide's done correctly as well, and how language does matter. And I know how, yet again, AAS was really pivotal with the webinar that we had back in April, also with the NIOA. And then again, we mentioned the FOP. But here's the thing, as Jackie mentioned too, it's got to be evidence-based when we're doing programs, and the collaboration with researchers and universities. And it's that whole idea of, again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel or invent the wheel. There's substantial research out there and researchers wanting to work with us. And we need to, not put up that blue wall, be more open and bring them in. And I like to think that in kind of the weird roles that I play, I can help, and I have tried to help bridge that gap between the researchers and academia with law enforcement to make sure whatever we're doing is sound and grounded in evidence-based practices, because that's critical, especially when we talk about suicide prevention. It can't just be anecdotal or winging it. That stuff is dangerous. It's got to be based on best practices.
I think pointing out partnerships is so important for a couple of reasons. One, that we're not always the experts on what we're talking about or what we're trying to talk about. And it doesn't mean anything about us. It doesn't mean anything about our roles. But if we are not reaching out to the people who are the experts and trying to, like you said, amplify our collective messaging, that's where the real power is. You know, one of the things that AAS always talks about is the power is in that multidisciplinary sort of effort, whether it's research, whether it's treatment, whether it's sharing resources. This has to come from a bunch of different places for it to really work and to really penetrate all these different settings and communities.
Yeah, and you know, another one which I forgot to mention, well, I'm doing it now, is AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And this is the appeal that I have to any law enforcement members that are on this or watching the recording. They've got chapters in every state, and they're there, boots on the ground, to help with any sort of outreach you're trying to do, that proactive outreach, trying to help connect people with services. And then again, in those unfortunate the post-vention situations when somebody does die by suicide, they are critical partners. And again, they're in every state. And places like New York, there's multiple chapters. Like I have a great working relationship with the national office, but as well as the New York City chapter. And we've done some incredible projects together. And they can sometimes, it's the messenger and the message. So sometimes no matter who you are within your agency, maybe people won't be willing to receive it as much, regardless of how good and qualified you are. That's why it's groups like AFSP and how they're so local based. They can come in and give talks as well. So it's not one or the other. Sometimes it's both, and it's a combination of the two. And they were phenomenal. And with AFSP, it sort of brings back to the work that AAS is doing, and they help fund some of the trainings I remember at previous conferences, is the law enforcement psychological autopsy. And I guess I'll just mention some of that right now as well, is trying to understand, we need to understand what happens when somebody dies by suicide in law enforcement. So AAS has had for many years the psychological autopsy training. What I helped develop was a specific one for law enforcement. And why? Because it's not that it's so unique and different from any other suicide. It's more of how do you collect and gather the data and then present the data. And it's AAS has been offering trainings now. I think already 4 have been done, and I know there's one coming up, I believe, in November. And I highly recommend people just at the very least consider it, dig deeper, get more information, because this is in the idea of the psych autopsy is gathering information to find out why the person died by suicide and trying to answer important questions. Well, why they die by suicide? Why by those means? And think importantly, why that day? If they've been in a tough spot for days, weeks, months, years, why they die that day by suicide? And then trying to explore what might have been able to been done to try to prevent it. And that's not from second guessing or blaming people. Absolutely not. That's where the preventative, proactive outreach comes in for trying to prevent it from happening again. And I know, Chris, you've got more info, or you could probably put it in there. And it's something that me personally, I think is truly very, very important. And I highly recommend people look into it. And if anyone has more questions on that, please reach out to me, because it's helped me be better at what I do as far as suicide prevention in law enforcement and beyond law enforcement. I got trained in it. I'm a certified psychoautopsy investigator, and I help try and spread that message specifically within law enforcement as well. And another great group, which I didn't mention earlier too, they really help amplify the message on that, is the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF. And they had a joint symposium a couple of years ago here in New York City with the NYPD, where they dedicated a substantial part to that on the value of the psychoautopsy. And they released a report last year too that goes into it as well. So a simple search of that on the internet, you can find that as well. I don't know, Chris, did you want to add anything on the psychoautopsy as well?
And I finally found the link, so I posted it in the comments. It looks like the dates are November 8th, 9th, and 10th, and we have a registration deadline of October 25th. So these are pretty well attended most of the time. So you want to make sure that you go ahead and register relatively quickly. Did you mention are there certain types of people or certain groups of people who should be registering as opposed to others? Who benefits from this?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And really, that's what I think the uniqueness of the law enforcement psychoautopsy compared to maybe the general one is how various people are involved. So the way I describe it's really anybody involved in law enforcement, if you're specifically law enforcement or on the, outside of law enforcement, but you're assisting those efforts. So first, it's important for like high level chiefs, commissioners to have a deeper understanding of suicide, but then also the psych autopsy and the value, of what it is and how it can help your agency not only better understand suicide, but then also work towards preventing it. Then I think it's definitely applicable then to the ranks below that, captains, lieutenants, but also the detective investigators, and how it can help them, not just again with officer suicides, but other suicides that they have to investigate or look into. But again, looking at it through the lens of law enforcement suicide, that's the job of the detective investigator, to try and find out more information. It absolutely can help them. But then also too, you look at like the outside psychologists, absolutely, that work with law enforcement agencies, where they can bring that extra skill to these agencies to try to help them. And there's also like, there's different ways to look at it. Get in the training. Do you have to do a proper psychological autopsy? Maybe, maybe not. But having that training allows you then to modify and adapt it, maybe to see how that fits within your style, the work you do, but also the needs of each particular agency. So there's the one, the initial training, but then the next two phases are going towards certification. So I highly recommend, honestly, to anybody in law enforcement, that first step, that phase one, is the 1-day training. And I believe the one that's coming up in November, it's being done online. It's live through Zoom. It's not in person. So it's really, no matter where you are, your geographic location doesn't limit you. And I'm not, and I know I'm speaking for you too, Chris, we're not here trying to sell anything. We're trying to raise awareness. And if that's not particularly, just make sure you're doing what you can to make sure your agency is understanding as much as they can when it comes to an officer suicide.
We're just trying to provide resources, and I want to make sure that folks know too that there is a normal psychological autopsy certification training, normal for non-law enforcement folks.
Regular, how about regular?
for non-law enforcement folks who, if you want to check that out, it looks like we have one coming up in November, but it is full, so you can join a waiting list. And I know that Jennifer Tinch, our training director, is always adding new dates for both of these. So keep an eye out on our website for more information about all of that stuff. But what I love about this too, Jeff, is that you've managed to take a program that traditionally was really focused on looking at on that sort of like the death component, and really trying to figure out what happened to this person, trying to unpack the complexity of that person's life and a really terrible place for them. But you've added that sort of prevention and postvention aspect too, that I think is really key. And again, goes to this action mindset. Like, why are we doing this if it isn't to prevent future suicides? I think that's really key, and especially in the setting that you're working too.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think just segueing from there, the last only topic that I had was that whole mindset of think different. And everything can't be suicide prevention, because like how we mentioned earlier, it's just, and people start to tune out. So how important like resilience type trainings are in trying to promote that overall positive mental health and well-being. But yet again, I remind everybody, just be careful with whatever trainings and stuff that you do within the grander scope of suicide prevention. One-off trainings and workshops are good, but what I appeal to everybody is make sure that they have takeaways and how it promotes in the continuation. Because if there's one thing I know, well, two things. One, in law enforcement, we all have resilience in us. That's been proven time and time and again, especially this past year, 2 years. So that's already known. We've got the resilience. It's more so working towards enhancing that. That's more accurate how I describe it. It's enhancing it. And the only way you enhance your resilience is by doing, not by listening. So making sure that, and this is where the burden's on the agencies, starting off in the police academy and then continuing throughout their career, but make sure it's not just that psychoeducational, but make sure it's interactive and practice-based. And that definitely work towards the suicide prevention efforts, but on a much grander scale of just having, mentally fit and positive health for the men and women in law enforcement. And that's something they absolutely deserve. Yeah.
Building a culture you want to live in, building a world you want to live in, right? That's all really important. I think those things that you mentioned are huge components of that. Jackie, yeah, and I was not at all trying to minimize what the PACT training does. It's a very practical, useful training that allows people to do things like Jackie's saying, looking at administrative mortality reviews, death investigations, root cause analysis. Right. There's all sorts of different uses for it. But yeah, so building that sort of life that folks want to live in, It relies on problem solving and resilience and working towards, not just not trying to kill yourself, but thriving, right?
Exactly.
So I think I think that's a wonderful point to make for sure.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if there's any other questions or anything, but that's all I've got for now. And honestly,
That's
Chris,
all. We didn't
that's
cover
all.
anything.
No, look, honestly, I really do genuinely appreciate the opportunity to share this. I hope people
Yeah.
found it helpful and useful. I'm here to help. And like you said earlier too, I don't have all the answers, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I think, given my amount of time being involved in this, I think I know probably if you have a question or something that I don't know the answer to, I think I'll know the person that does have the answer. And I love being able to connect people with other resources as well, because look, honestly, we're all in this together, and it truly is a team effort. And the work that partnerships I've done with AAS, I'm very grateful for and appreciative. So thank you, Chris, and everybody else there.
Yeah, no, and I want to reiterate what you were just saying. Anybody who actually does reach out to Jeff for any reason, Jeff makes sure to include everybody and everything. This is not a exclusivity type deal with Jeff. We all have to be working together. So if there's value in what you want to do and there's work to be done, Jeff will make sure that it happens. So, and I thank you, Jeff, for jumping on and talking about these things. I always enjoy these conversations because they are just jam-packed full of like really, really critical and important information that I don't think people hear very often. So I appreciate you jumping on. I would say if anybody does have any more questions, Jeff's email is in the chat. Just shoot him an email and we'll make that happen. So, Jeff, is there any final thoughts? Anything you want people to leave with today?
I guess especially to members in law enforcement, first responders, as well as to everybody in general. It's just, especially though in law enforcement, I think we've making a lot of headway in checking in with each other. I think we can't forget the first person we got to check in on is ourselves. And let's make sure now the support that we're offering and pushing out there to our brothers and sisters in blue, make sure we're on that line too. And make sure you push yourself up to the front of the line, because we can't say we don't have time for it. We've got to make sure we're taking care of ourselves, and it's the best way to look after our brothers and sisters and the public. And one day at a time, that's it. And every now and then look around. You're not on this path alone, and there's plenty of us out there, and help is available if you need it. And also, don't forget, if you're doing good, take a moment, reflect on that too. If you're doing good, soak it in, and share a smile sometimes with somebody. That's the best step one. And again, I'll smile as I am happy and genuinely grateful for this, Chris. So back to you, brother.
Well, we're smiling together, man. So again, well said. And I appreciate you jumping on and having this conversation and this chat with us today and sharing all these awesome resources. So, and thanks for everybody else tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Hit Jeff up if you have questions. I got it there.